who's going to be here for another 30 years, another 30 years after that, another 30 years after that.
They drew that line many years ago with like a ruler, just a straight line right across the top of the country. When you look at that beautiful formation when it's together, I'm a very artistic person, but when I looked at that beauty, I said, that's the way it was meant to be.
What you have accomplished, it's a remarkably competitive company, it's a world leader.
Trump just slapped Canada with the harshest steel tariffs yet, claiming it would make America great. But instead of cracking under pressure, Canada might be the one walking away stronger, thanks to Mark Carney's silent, calculated revenge. What's going on, and why is Europe quietly applauding? Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. Imagine you're a Canadian steel producer walking into your office one morning only to find out that doing business with your largest trade partner, the United States, just became twice as expensive overnight. No heads up, no warning, just a sudden slap with a 50% tariff on steel, effective immediately. That's the chaos Trump unleashed with one of his boldest and least thought out moves. To set the scene, Trump had already hit Canada with a 25% tariff on steel imports back in 2018. That tariff had caused enough drama on its own, but doubling it to 50%? That was more than just business. It was personal. The timing couldn't have been worse. Canadian steel executives were gearing up for contracts and shipments that were now slipping into pandemonium. Shipments were halted, trucks sat idle at border crossings, and warehouses suddenly swelled with steel that nobody on the US side wanted to touch anymore because the math simply didn't add up.
In addition, we will double down on the partnerships that we have with the industry. As you know, a lot of the big investments here have been in partnership with the federal government, with the Ontario government.
Medical cares and other things. There would be a lot of advantages, but it would be a massive tax cut. And it's also a beautiful, you know, as a real estate developer, you know, I'm a real estate developer at heart.
DeFasco and ArcelorMittal. Let me just say one other point, or make a couple other points with respect to the United States and the relationship there.
It was the kind of move that threw supply chains, already delicately balanced, into complete disarray. And don't think this was just Canada's problem. For American industries relying on Canadian steel, this felt like shooting themselves in the foot. In aerospace manufacturing, for example, the ripple effects were immediate. American companies that needed high-quality Canadian steel for precision components had to scramble to find alternatives. Car manufacturers, another major user of Canadian steel, also felt the squeeze. Suppliers couldn't just change their entire material strategy overnight. They'd spent years building supply lines based on reliability and affordability. Now, costs were ballooning faster than someone could say, "Make America great again." And ironically, some of those costs were trickling right down to American consumers. Canadian steel leaders weren't quiet about how this move hit them. One executive called it a punch in the gut, clearly frustrated not just by the financial hit, but also by what it represented. Trump hadn't just thrown a wrench into decades of trade integration, he'd undermined trust. For years, the US and Canada had built something that looked like the gold standard for trade partnerships. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it worked. Goods, services, and investments flowed across borders so seamlessly that industries could focus on growing rather than fighting off sudden tariffs. To have that trust broken so abruptly, with barely a reason, went beyond steel. This was about whether the US could still be viewed as a reliable partner. What makes the whole thing even more baffling is how quickly Trump's tariff plans began to backfire. The strategy on paper was supposed to help secure the American steel industry, propping up struggling domestic producers, but instead it ricocheted right back at American industries dependent on affordable steel. Think about it. The aerospace industry alone employs tens of thousands of people and pulls billions of dollars into the economy. Add auto manufacturing to the mix, and you're looking at critical parts of the US economy suddenly strained by higher material costs. Exactly the opposite of what was intended. The chaos was even worse behind the scenes. Canadian officials scrambled to make sense of the decision. Was it a negotiating tactic? Some kind of retaliation for unrelated grievances? Or just Trump being Trump and throwing a curveball at the worst possible time? Whatever the reason, it left everyone on edge, wondering what might come next. While Trump was out, stirring headlines and declaring victory in the trade war, Mark Carney had something else in mind. And no, it didn't involve Twitter rants or loud proclamations. Carney, with his polished demeanor and economist's precision, was quietly sketching out a plan, one that would chip away at Canada's reliance on its southern neighbor. If Trump wanted chaos, Carney was prepared to counter it with calm, calculated moves. Carney's first step, silence. While Canadian businesses were reeling from the sudden tariffs, Carney didn't rush to make the rounds on the media circuit or fire back with dramatic retaliatory measures. Instead, he let his trade minister handle the initial backlash. You could almost picture him sitting back, scanning reports, and mapping out a strategy that went far beyond steel. It wasn't about one tariff or one dispute. It was about rethinking Canada's entire economic and political relationship with the United States. This wasn't a reactionary move. This was a long-term pivot. And that pivot started with a clear message. If the US wanted to play the unpredictable partner, Canada wouldn't wait around to see what other surprises Trump had in store. Carney signaled a historic shift in Canadian foreign policy, one that sent a clear warning. Canada was no longer willing to keep its eggs all in the American basket. His approach wasn't loud or sensational, but it was unmistakable in its intent. Trump's erratic decision-making had pushed Canada to the edge, and Carney wasn't interested in letting it happen again. What made Carney's plan uniquely effective was his ability to think globally. While Trump was doubling down on America's short-term goals, Carney was taking the opportunity to untangle Canada from its decades-long dependence on its southern neighbor. Behind the scenes, Carney began exploring new partnerships that could open doors for Canada far beyond North America. And unlike Trump's chaotic grab-and-hope approach, Carney worked quietly but purposefully. This was where Carney's European roots became a secret weapon. Born to British parents and educated at Oxford, Carney had a deep understanding of the political and economic dynamics across the Atlantic. Instead of seeking concessions from the US, he began establishing connections with new trade and defense partners overseas. Take Europe's $900 billion Rearm Europe project, for example. Canada wasn't just showing interest, it was actively engaging at a high level. This was part of Carney's broader plan to reduce reliance on US arms and strengthen ties with European nations. It was the kind of move that Trump wouldn't have seen coming, mostly because it required something he didn't possess: subtlety. Carney's efforts weren't just about trade and defense either. They were a direct challenge to Trump's assumption that Canada needed the US to stay afloat. By steering Canada toward reliable partners in Europe and Asia, Carney was sending a message. Canada wouldn't crumble under tariffs or tantrums. Instead, it was preparing to thrive without the United States casting its shadow over every decision. His confidence in turning outward was only bolstered by the chaos Trump had caused within his own industrial base, as American companies began quietly urging their government to reconsider these punitive tariffs. This wasn't just a momentary shift, this was strategy in action. Carney gave Canada the confidence to start stepping out of America's shadow. He didn't frame it as retaliation because it wasn't. This wasn't about trading punches. It was about writing the playbook for a more self-reliant and diversified Canada. Even his first official trip as Prime Minister set the tone when he skipped Washington and went straight to Europe, where he famously declared, "Canada is the most European of non-European countries." If that wasn't a polite but pointed shrug in America's direction, I don't know what was. Carney recognized an opportunity that went beyond tariffs. This was Canada's chance to redefine its place on the global stage. So while Trump's focus stayed firmly on winning, whatever that meant in his world, Carney was laying the groundwork for a Canada that could succeed without holding onto America's coattails. This wasn't about making an exit. This was about calling the US's bluff, showing that Canada wasn't the sidekick but a capable player in its own right. And it didn't end there. As European leaders responded warmly to Canada's overtures, Carney's strategic silence took on a new weight. Even NATO partnerships began shifting slightly as Canada explored alternative approaches to defense spending. The Rearm Europe project wasn't just a splashy investment opportunity, it symbolized a path toward independence, demonstrating that Canada wasn't afraid of rethinking everything, from economies to alliances. Carney's moves weren't flashy, but they were effective, and that's the irony here. While Trump shouted, threatened and tweeted, Canada's leader moved with the kind of subtlety Trump didn't even bother to fake. The tariffs may have been designed to isolate Canada, but instead they pushed it toward finding strength on its own. What Trump never realized was that, in a way, he was Canada's wake-up call. Mark Carney wasn't just retaliating, he was preparing Canada for something bigger. By the time the US began noticing the cracks forming in its control, Carney had already planted the seeds for Canada's transformation. This wasn't just about standing up to Trump, it was about proving that Canada didn't need to stand behind the US to carve out its own legacy. And believe me, that legacy wasn't going to include playing second fiddle. What happens when one country tries to strong-arm another into submission? Well, sometimes the underdog doesn't just fight back, it thrives. That's exactly what might be happening with Canada after Trump's steel tariff tantrum. Instead of collapsing under the pressure, Canada is transforming, and this breakup with the United States could actually be the beginning of its biggest glow-up yet. Trump's aggressive tariffs didn't just hit Canada's economy, they delivered a cold reality check. Canadian leaders were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Their economy was far too intertwined with America's. Decades of trade deals and shared supply chains had created a relationship that, for all its benefits, left Canada incredibly vulnerable to sudden US policy changes. Or, let's face it, the whims of a president who made decisions like he was flipping coins. Trump's tariffs forced Canada to do something it hadn't done in a long time: prioritize independence. The psychological shift was seismic. Canadian leaders weren't just debating tariffs anymore. They started planning for a future where the US wasn't in the driver's seat. Mark Carney spearheaded this change by focusing on the bigger picture. Instead of trying to patch things up with Washington as they'd done before, Canada began building new walls and exploring new trade routes. Carney made it clear, Canada wasn't interested in being an economic afterthought to Trump's America First agenda. One of the most symbolic moves in this shift was Canada's growing interest in Rearm Europe, an ambitious $900 billion defense project designed to modernize European militaries and reduce reliance on US arms. This kind of partnership wasn't just about buying military equipment, it was a statement. By aligning itself with Europe, Canada was signaling to the world that it was stepping out of America's shadow. Rearm Europe wasn't anchored in transactional deals or threats, like Trump's proposals often felt. It represented a shared vision built on mutual respect, not just economic leverage. And let's not forget the optics of all this. For decades, Canada had been seen as America's trustiest sidekick, always ready to back up its flashier neighbor. But suddenly, Canada was stepping forward, not just as a loyal ally, but as a power of its own. It wasn't just about defense investments either. This shift rippled across industries. Canada's interest in diversifying its trade beyond the US pushed leaders to explore new markets in Asia and Europe, opening up opportunities that had been largely ignored until now. These new partnerships didn't just insulate Canada from the chaos of Trump-era policies, they also gave it a stronger bargaining position on the world stage. Economically, this shift might be a blessing in disguise. By breaking away from its heavy dependence on US trade and supply chains, Canada can develop industries with more secure, diversified foundations. Imagine Canadian steel being exported seamlessly to Europe, or Canadian tech companies flourishing in Asian markets. These aren't pipe dreams anymore. Moving away from the United States doesn't mean turning its back on trade. It means trading smarter. It's about ensuring that no single partner, especially one as unpredictable as Trump's America, can hold Canada hostage. The military benefits are just as significant. Take Trump's proposal that Canada joined the US Golden Dome air defense system. On its surface, it sounded like a logical idea, a shared defense initiative between close allies. But when the price tag came in at $61 billion, it felt less like a partnership and more like a ransom note. Some Canadian officials weren't shy about calling it coercion. Why would Canada sink such a massive sum into the Golden Dome when it could invest in European defense projects like Rearm Europe, where the terms were far more balanced and the respect flowed in both directions? What's more, this isn't just a knee-jerk reaction to Trump's antics. Canada's pivot to Europe and Asia carries long-term benefits that go beyond immediate retaliation. By aligning itself with partners who take a more stable, cooperative approach to trade and defense, Canada is laying the groundwork for something that will far outlast one president's time in office. Even the United States can see the writing on the wall. As Canada strengthens its global alliances, it's increasingly increasingly clear that America isn't the sole focus of its foreign policy anymore. And if we zoom out, it's hard not to appreciate the broader symbolism here. Canada's decision to push back against Trump's coercion sends a clear message to the world. It's no one's backup plan. From rethinking trade and forging ties with Europe to refusing to let its defense strategy be dictated by a giant invoice, Canada is carving out its own path, and that path looks brighter than ever. So, isn't it ironic? Trump's obsession with making America great again might just be what makes Canada greater. The more he tried to isolate Canada with his tariffs and strong-arm tactics, the more Canada found new ways to grow. It's almost poetic. Trump's policies, designed to protect his own economy and build walls, might end up being the very thing that helped Canada build bridges. Now, isn't that a plot twist? Trump's big plan to isolate Canada didn't just flop, it backfired in a way he probably never saw coming. Instead of breaking down under pressure, Canada stepped up, rewired its economy, and started looking for new friends on the global stage. That protective wall Trump tried to build, Canada turned it into a launch pad. And here's the kicker, while Trump's policies screamed short-term thinking, they pushed Canada into long-term wins. So is this the start of a new global shift, where America's closest allies find strength far from its orbit? One thing's clear, Canada didn't just survive, it thrived.